Hi, my name is Patrick Warfield, and today is March 17th, 2017. I'm here at the home of our interviewee, Mr. Robert Charles Goodrich, Jr. And today we're going to conduct this interview pursuant to the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. Bob, please state your full name and tell us a little bit about yourself.
You were correct, Robert Charles Goodrich, Jr. I was born in Perth Amboy, New Jersey on June 11th, 1956. At age 5, I moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and became a Southerner, and grew up on Signal Mountain in Chattanooga.
You and I have worked together for 5 years now, and this is the first time I've ever known you to be a carpetbagger, so yes. I'm glad to hear that.
I am, and that has been part of what has shaped me.
So tell me a little bit about your birth family, your grandparents, your parents. Give us their names and so forth.
My father was Robert Charles Goodrich, Sr. The name Goodrich is a phonetic change from the name Gergovich because his parents immigrated from Croatia. His father, Charles Gergovich, worked in the steel mills in Gary, Indiana when he immigrated to the United States. And so my dad was raised in Gary, Indiana in the steel mill world. His dad died when he was young, when he was 12 years old. My mother, Mary Blue Lawton, was an Army brat, grew up in various states, but primarily Michigan and Wyoming. She was a Lawton, and her father was a doctor, an Army doctor, and traveled, was in various locations throughout his career. And they met when she was 19, and he was 21. He was in the Air Force, and they had to go to Utah to get married because she wasn't old enough to get married in Wyoming. So they went across state lines to go to get married in Utah, and they were married for over 60 years when they passed away in 2010.
And after they moved from New Jersey, they were in Chattanooga, right?
Well, there was another stop on the way. My dad was a chemical engineer. He went to Purdue on the GI Bill, and ended up getting a job in New Jersey in the chemical industry, and then was transferred. We were in New Jersey. I'm not sure how long they were there before I was born, but they were in New Jersey 6 or 7 years, I think. And the chemical company transferred him to Chattanooga, which was at that point one of the in the center of the textile industry, which had moved out of New England into the South for cheap power and cheap labor and not many environmental regulations. But the textile industry, which is now almost gone in the South, was really significant in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
And so what age were you when you moved to Chattanooga?
5.
5. And do you have any siblings?
I have a sister, Jeannie, Phyllis Jean Goodrich, and she is now in Atlanta and is a med tech at a hospital called Northside Hospital in Atlanta.
Older or younger sister? 63
years old. I'm 60.
So tell me about growing up in Chattanooga.
Well, it's interesting what the memories, great memories. Signal Mountain, Tennessee is one of the best places in the world to grow up, and lots of great memories of baseball and creeks and woods and endless play days on the bikes. But we moved there in 1961, and it was Jim Crow in Chattanooga in 1961. This is people forget these things, and Chattanooga, being an industrial town, was one of the most polluted cities in the United States. You couldn't see 20 feet some days because of the air pollution. It sits I lived on Signal Mountain. There's Lookout Mountain on the other side of town. There's another mountain called Raccoon Mountain, and then there's Missionary Ridge. So Chattanooga sits in a bowl, and it had lots of factories and very polluted air and water. So it was a really interesting town at that point from that time. And my parents grew to love the South and love Chattanooga, but they were Northerners. I don't know that they'd ever been in the South before they moved. My dad was a Big Ten fan, so he never embraced the Southeastern Conference. We always hated the University of Tennessee just because it was in the South and it was University of Tennessee. So I had somewhat of a Northern perspective from my parents, even though I was in the South most of my life. I didn't grow up in a traditional set of, in a Southern home with Southern values, different food, different culture.
Right. You mentioned the Jim Crow era. Many Southern cities had various reactions to the Civil Rights Movement, Jim Crow. In your experience growing up in Chattanooga, how would you describe their reaction and what the city was undergoing during that time?
You know, I can't remember a lot of that because I was pretty young, but some of this is just things I know in retrospect. Chattanooga was very segregated. The Howard and Riverside high schools, when I went to a grammar school on Signal Mountain, Thrasher School, which was a great elementary school, but Signal Mountain was white. Absolutely white. You didn't have, unless you were a maid, you probably weren't welcome on Signal Mountain, and that was probably during the daytime. I remember people making comments like that in that era. I then went on to McCauley School, which was a private all-boys school that was military for a couple years, and eventually we had a handful of African-American students, but integration was just coming into that school in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was beginning to struggle with just beginning to integrate. And when we played sports, we were basically an all-white team we played all-black schools. And it went fine, and it was a wonderful experience, but we were a long way from any sort of real integration.
Tell me a little about your experience at McCauley. Did you enjoy it?
McCauley's been one of the most important parts of my life. I was, my dad didn't make a lot of money, and to them, coming from the North, private schools were for juvenile delinquents, and they had no perception of that you would send a kid to a private school. That just was not in any culture that they were used to. And then when they moved to Signal Mountain, they moved next door to a family that had 2 boys at McCauley School. And I played a lot of sports in elementary school and got to know other kids who were bound for McCauley. And some of those parents got my parents interested in sending me to McCauley, but we couldn't afford to go to McCauley. So I got a scholarship to go to McCauley School. I think McCauley cost $500 a year. And I got a full scholarship to go to McCauley, which again, my parents had to be convinced that it wasn't a school for juvenile delinquents, and they became huge McCauley supporters once they understood what McCauley had to offer. But I hit there in 7th grade. I was small. I was, behind the development curve of some of the guys there, and it was tough. And I was much less wealthy than a lot of people there, and it took me a while to adjust to that. But over the course of McCauley, it became a part of me. I love it to this day. It instilled a lot of values in me. I love playing sports there. The academics were first rate. It was not a tremendously wealthy institution at the time, but after I left, its endowment grew into where it's a powerhouse school now. But it was very influential in my life, and my McCauley friends are still among my closest friends. And I think it was much more influential to me than college or law school. I mean, it was a real foundation time for me.
How would you say it was more influential? I mean, what was it? If you could describe its lasting mark on you, what would you say it would be?
Well, that would come from several aspects. I was an English major in college, and I'd always loved to read, but McCauley really brought out the love of literature and language for me. From 7th grade, when we had the greatest grammar teacher on the planet, Captain Bill Tate, who wrote his own grammar book and diagram sentences, which gave me a foundation in grammar, and then later teachers who had absolutely passionate loves for literature, which really fed me. So academically, it was that way. McCauley had an honor system that I revere to this day, which really instilled the values of honor that UVA had as well, but that was my first exposure to that. Sports were a major part of my life. I played football, basketball, and ran track at McCauley, and the bonds I made with my teammates, last to this day. So that was a real foundational part of my experience. So it really kind of hit on all cylinders. Interestingly, this is just a little side note, McCauley is a Christian school, and it was sort of in a fundamentalist mode at the time, which really pushed me away. I returned later. I guess I credit McCauley for pushing me away only to have me come back in the religious sense. But it didn't, it sort of had the opposite effect it was intended to have from a spiritual side at the point when I was in high school. I wasn't having any of that at Macaulay. But it did sort of resonate later, you know.
So basically a foundation for that at some point, but
Yes.
it may have sort of pushed you away.
And I had a Bible teacher in 7th grade named Yo Strang, and Yo was what I call a gentle soul. You know, the first question on every Bible test was, who was on the road to Damascus and where was Paul going? Yo was the kindest, gentlest man, and he lived that Christianity, and that spoke louder than a lot of the bombast and a lot of the other stuff that was going on at the time. So I saw some real examples of that spirit at Macaulay, and so that sunk deep.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier you went to UVA for college. Describe to us really how you chose UVA. How did you end up there?
I'm almost embarrassed to talk about that because today, you know, I've had 3 children go to college, and we do these very intense researches of colleges and curriculums and cost, and apply to no telling how many schools. And you know, we were just very unsophisticated at the time. I had friends at Macaulay who went to Virginia. The quarterback of my high school football team was a year older than me, and he went to Virginia to play football. Had a couple other friends go, and I went up there to visit and had a fantastic time and thought this is really fun. It was far enough away from my parents that I was interested in going at the time. I didn't want to be, you know, under their thumb. And it was University of Virginia in 1974 was, I mean, something like $1,000 or $1,200 as an out-of-state. It was a state school. It was out of state. It had a great reputation. So I really just sort of, you know, followed a couple people I respected, had a good time, squeaked in. I was very good in language-oriented courses at Macaulay, but my math skills were not quite up to the same level as my language skills, and so my grades were okay. And I didn't, you know, you could get away with doing less back then. I mean, I was a good student, but I was not an excellent student. I would never even think about applying to a school like that today. But you know, I was fortunate that I was in a time when that was a possibility. So Virginia was a great option for me at the time.
And what did you study while you were there?
Well, I was an English major, I'm a diehard liberal arts advocate. You know, we hear a lot of debate today about more practical majors, and I took everything. I took Zen Buddhism. I took cinema as an art form. I took economics. I took accounting. I took computer programming. I took Russian history, Russian government. I still remember a lot of those classes. I took a lot of religion classes, a lot of English classes, but I just used, the English major was easy. Loved to write, loved to read, loved it, but it also just allowed me to just expand, you know, to go into all sorts of areas in the fullest liberal arts sense, which was, I'm really grateful that I did that, and I really still advocate that today.
And after Virginia, if I remember correctly, you took some time off and worked in another career other than law. What did you do?
Yes, I had it seemed to me that everybody at college, and this is probably the way people think about it today, was really motivated and directed and had career aspirations, none of which I was pretty directionless. Not unhappy to be directionless, but I was not, since everybody was either pre-med or pre-law or pre-business school, I was none of the above. I just enjoyed my education, and I thought to myself, you know, who has had an impact on me, and what would I like to do next? I'd had coaches that had a huge impact on me at Macaulay, and teachers, and I thought it would be wonderful to go teach school and coach. And so I started looking for a job teaching and coaching, and was fortunate to find a job at a school called Brookstone that's in Columbus, Georgia. One of the Macaulay family, Jim Macaulay, had gone down to Columbus to become the headmaster of Brookstone School, and of course he knew my Macaulay background. Macaulay also had the founder of Macaulay was a UVA graduate, Parks Macaulay. So anyway, those connections I'm sure were interesting and useful, and I found myself in Columbus, Georgia for a couple of years teaching English to seniors and freshmen and coaching football and basketball.
And what made you leave that career path and move into the law?
Well, I wish I could. I wish I could be a little more. I wish I had a more altruistic motive, but some of it's altruistic, some of it's not. I first of all was, maybe you're always ill-equipped to start teaching. I know you taught some, and you know how this feeling is, but I had no idea what I was doing. I was trying hard, but I'd been an English student. I'd never had any education classes. You know, I was really struggling to be even marginally competent as a teacher, and that's tough. And I was doing that, you know, every day from 8 to 3, and then going to coach from 3 to 6, and then going home and trying to get prepared for the next day. And I realized if I'm going to be the kind of teacher I want to be, this is going to be a long, hard process. And the people who were really skilled at teaching, and Brookstone had several, were you know, master teachers who'd put in a lot of years to get there. And that was a daunting realization. And I remember my first year, I think I made $8,900, and I got a bonus. I got a raise the next year to $9,600, and I think they included my coaching stipend. And I had, you know, I needed to make more money. I wasn't prepared to live on that. I realized I could never buy a car. I maybe not even be able to buy a washing machine. You know, I had some economic reality about that. Now, things have changed to some extent, and still teachers don't make enough money. But as I did that for a couple of years, realized the difficulty of the journey and the, you know, the very bare bones economics of it, I decided I better look for something else.
One of the required questions is to ask about any military service you may have had. Did you serve in any capacity in the military?
I did not. Macaulay was military school for 2 years, and I marched around with a toy gun and did parades and wore my military uniform, but that was the extent of my military service.
All right. So you're teaching school in Georgia. You're thinking about going to law school. How did you end up choosing Vanderbilt University?
Well, let me back up to law, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do even then. And people ask how you choose a career. My mother had 2 brothers, and my mother didn't get to go to college. She had 2 brothers, and her parents decided that the boys needed to go to college, but the girl didn't need to go to college. My mother was probably the smartest of the 3 of them, and that always was hard for her that she didn't go to college. But her younger brother, Gip Lawton, went to college and went to University of Michigan Law School, became a lawyer and a judge in Kentucky. And I think she revered that and she had a couple things going on. When the Hoffa trial was going on, she would go down and listen to the Hoffa trial in Chattanooga. You know, you had to go early to get a seat to see the Hoffa trial. I don't know how she got interested in that, but she was fascinated with legal goings-on, and revered her younger brother, who was a lawyer in Kentucky. So she used to say to me occasionally, you know, you're going to be a lawyer someday, probably because I talked all the time, you know, incessant chattering. She probably thought that was a good legal skill, but she may have set the seed. I didn't think I was paying any attention, but that was part of it. And the second thing I did was just go back and say to myself, what do you do well? What skills do you have? I didn't have, you know, my science skills are not good. My math skills are okay, but they're not advanced. I wrote very well. I got really positive feedback on my writing in college and in high school. I analyzed things well, and I spoke well. I was articulate. I read a lot, so I had a pretty expansive vocabulary, and I was argumentative, and not in a negative way, but I mean, you know, I liked to have discussions. So when I thought about those skills, I took the GMATs and the LSATs, and really thought about, well, I didn't know much about what being a lawyer was, but it seemed that those skills were consistent with what lawyers did, as to the extent I knew. I had very little. My dad wasn't a lawyer. I never did really see what my uncle did, so I was very naive about what lawyers actually do, but I just went back to sort of the basic skill set and said that's the direction I should head. Now, I'll get back to what your question was about Vanderbilt.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, again, very fortunate. I did well in the LSATs and applied to Vanderbilt. And I was invited to the Patrick Wilson Scholarship Weekend, which was Patrick Wilson Scholarship was a scholarship given to 5 students a year by the Patrick Wilson family. And that was my introduction to Vanderbilt. I did not receive the Patrick Wilson Scholarship, but I had to write an essay to apply, and there was another scholarship called the Elliott Cheatham Scholarship, which was started by James Gooch, Jim Cheek, and several other lawyers who were very fond of a professor at Vanderbilt when they were there named Elliott Cheatham. And they called me up after the Patrick Wilson and offered me the Cheatham Scholarship, which it wasn't quite as generous as the Patrick Wilson, but it was wonderful. And there's one Cheatham scholar in every class, and I was very, very grateful to get that, and that made the Vanderbilt decision very easy.
And so you started Vanderbilt in what year?
1980.
1980. Describe some of your classmates you may have been with.
I had some characters. It was good, like any law school class. A lot of really, really smart kids who've done well, straight A's their whole lives. A lot of type A personalities. That's what you expect with a bunch of law students. I was coming at it from a little bit different perspective. I was married after my first year of teaching, so I'd been married a year when I came to law school, and I'd been out of school for 2 years. So, I was very anxious, positively anxious, to go back to school after you've been in front of a class for 2 years trying to teach people. The opportunity to sit in a classroom with a really smart professor teaching you all is a wonderful, and the people who go straight into law school are probably tired of being in class and a little less overjoyed to be in class at 8 o'clock in the morning, when I was thrilled to be in that environment. But one of the guys I got really close with was a guy named Zan Blue. Zan probably skipped several grades in high school because he was so smart, just amazingly smart. He ended up being the Founders Medalist at Vanderbilt. Really quirky, sometimes abrasive guy, probably a lot of chip on the shoulder kind of stuff to mask some insecurities. But I got to know him very well. We became very good friends. I was not anywhere near in his league intellectually, but we hit it off, had a lot of good times. I was on the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, which is a law review type book, and I was a managing editor. And when you do that, you just get, you bond with the people on the review, and we spent hours. This is before we got a computer the third year, so this is when you're doing a lot of blue booking with pens and pencils and going over these articles and reading them back and forth, and it was a very laborious but fun process. So Judy Norris was a person on the law review. Dan Fitzpatrick was the editor. One person I became very close to, and am still close to, Bill Norton, who's a bankruptcy lawyer in Nashville, was a year ahead of me, and he was my predecessor as the managing editor of the Vanderbilt Journal. So I met him then, and if I was ever going to feel sorry for myself about the hard life of a law student, Bill had a child. I had no children. He was married. He had a child. He had a job downtown for 20 hours a week, and he was the managing editor of the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law. And he just seemed to do that without breaking a sweat. But he and I are still friends, and we practice. We're usually on opposite sides of cases, but I got to be good friends with him in law school.
So you mentioned that you and your wife, and your wife's full name is?
Sally Tanner Goodrich.
Were married after your first year of teaching.
Right.
When you told her you were going to go to law school, what was her reaction?
Well, the really funny reaction was when I told her that she was coming down to Columbus, Georgia with me. Sally we met at UVA when she was 17 and I was 18. We met first month of school, and we hit it off immediately and have been together ever since. So even though we weren't married until 1979, we've really been together since the fall of 1974. It's hard to believe it's been that long. It's been wonderful. But so she stayed at UVA to get a master's degree in counseling the year I went down to Columbus. And then I asked her to marry me, and she said yes, and we were married. And she came to Columbus with me, never totally foreign, little small town, very insular, nice people, but it's a small town, and so she needed a job. So she and Brookstone had to fulfill certain requirements to be an accredited school, needed to have guidance counselor. So they made her a guidance counselor for K through 12 as a first right out of college.
It's a large number of people.
She had to design some sort of curriculum for everybody in the school, with some sort of counseling. And that was, a young woman in a new town, in a new school. I don't know what she was getting paid, but, our combined incomes were probably pretty meager.
You're not going to afford a cheeseburger here and there.
So the law school decision, she was pretty happy about the law school decision. We'll put it that way.
For the economics of it, or just getting out of Columbus?
There were a couple things. I don't want to be at all disrespectful of Columbus. They treated me, given my skill set, which was meager, and they were very generous to me in terms of compassion and understanding and help, and it was wonderful. I couldn't ask for nicer people. Mm-hmm. But leaving Tennessee, it wasn't until I was in Georgia that I realized I'm a Tennessean. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just felt like I needed to be back in Tennessee. And I could have gone to another law school too, but Sally's from here. And the fact that I was going to law school and taking her back to Nashville, where her parents and several of her sisters live, was pretty much nirvana. In fact, we ended up, we rented a duplex on the corner of Fairfax and Chesterfield. And it was it was townhouse duplex. The other half was with her sister and the son-in-law, Mark Fraley. He was the son-in-law then before they were married. And Mark was at the what they used to call the YMCA Law School by night, and they worked at the Tennessee Department of Conservation during the day. And sister-in-law Beth was at the Owen Business School at Vanderbilt. So Sally was a pretty happy camper to be back in her home stomping grounds with her family.
So going back to law school, in the summertime, what firms did you clerk for? What did you do during that time? Just give us a little snapshot.
Very good, very good. Again, I had very little concept of what lawyers did, and it shocked me that seemingly 6 weeks into law school, people were talking about summer jobs for the next summer. I felt like my feet hadn't even hit the ground yet, and there's this recruiting thing going on, and people are, flapping their wings about what offers they'd gotten and callbacks and flybacks, and I was kind of at a loss. But the law firm of Miller and Martin, which was in Chattanooga, back then it was just in Chattanooga. I had old friends there from Macaulay School, and I'd been in Chattanooga my whole life, so they offered me a summer clerkship, and I went down to Chattanooga and clerked there all summer. And I didn't have any idea what law firms did, so I've told people this many times. As I was writing my memos in the library, my legal briefs or whatever they had me writing, which is what I thought lawyers did, I walked around and noticed all these lawyers on the phone all the time. And I thought, well, why don't they ever work? Why are they talking on the phone all the time? That's not what lawyers do. I just had so little concept of what being a lawyer in a law firm was about. It was an incredibly good experience. They were great to me. I did learn a little more over the summer about what happens in law firms and that actually give advice over the phone.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
When did you learn that we do a lot of talking?
It took me a while to figure out that guy wasn't talking to his bookie or his wife. He was actually probably working with a client on a problem on the telephone. But, I'd been to law school a year. You went to the library. You wrote, you went to court. But this phone business and this negotiation business, I had just not seen much of. I was just very, very naive, and it was a great, I learned a lot over the course of the summer.
So first summer you worked at Miller and Martin.
Right.
What did you do the second summer?
Second summer, Sally, my wife, had dated in high school a guy named Frank Garrison, and Frank at that time was a lawyer at Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday, and I didn't know much about Nashville firms, but he I'd met him, and of course he knew Sally and thought highly of her, and picked up the phone one day and asked me to come interview to clerk at Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday in my second summer. And I went down and I ate lunch with Tom Kanaday, it's a funny memory, I was very sick that day, just had the stomach bug or something, couldn't eat a bite. But Tom Kanaday and Frank took me up to the City Club, which is the top of the building where Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday was, and I was completely wowed, flattered to be offered, to be discussing a job with them, and they subsequently offered me an internship for the summer. And so I spent my second entire summer at Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday.
Which I'm sure Sally was happy with, as opposed to the Miller and Martin.
Well, yeah, I mean, she wouldn't want to be in Nashville, but she was okay with that. You always want to go home again, and in a way, part of you does. But Chattanooga was not, at that time, I think, a very good place for young lawyers. The business market was not growing. There was more hoarding of client work among lawyers because there wasn't new work. And the development path appeared to me to be much more limited than in Nashville, where things were booming, and young lawyers seemed to have a lot more opportunity early on to get involved in matters and to develop as lawyers in a more vibrant economy. So it turned out to be a really good business decision to be in Nashville in 1983 than to be anywhere else. And then, you leave and you go back and it's not the same. You're an adult and it's a different town. And I love Chattanooga still, but it wasn't a place for me to be at that point in my life.
And you mentioned that your mother sort of had this third-party interest in the law, the Hoffa trial. What was your parents' reaction for you when you went to law school and decided to be a lawyer? Were they proud of that? Were they happy with the decision?
I think there were mixed feelings in a way, because my father had a chemical business and I had worked there during the summers, and he always had some desire that I would follow in his footsteps. And even, I think he thought teaching was going to be temporary, which turned out to be correct. But he'd hoped I would decide at some point to come back and work with him. And I didn't, again, my dad was somewhat of a genius in terms of chemistry and chemical engineering. And that was not a skill set that I had, and nor was I really interested in coming back to Chattanooga. So I think he was a little disappointed in that, that I didn't do that. But I think they were thrilled that I went to Vanderbilt and, was on my way to what they thought to be a good career. So a little bit of a mixed I think there were some mixed sentiments there, but overall very positive.
So in 1983, you start practicing. You and Sally were married. When did you start your family?
Let's see. My son Bobby was born in 1987. We had a daughter, Grace, in 1990, and a son, Christopher, in 1992.
And where were y'all living at the time?
It's funny, people laugh. We moved out of the Fairfax-Chesterfield townhome or duplex into Lincoln Court, which is which is off Leake Avenue. We now live on Confederate Drive, so there's people have gotten kind of tickled that we moved from Lincoln Court to Confederate Drive, but which is not exactly in keeping with my political sentiments. But we bought a nice little brick, solid, very plain house over on Lincoln Court, which is probably 8 times more expensive now than it was back then. But bought an $85,000 house in 1980. When did we buy that house? 84. And had several good years there, and loved the neighborhood, and that was our first house. And this is where you're sitting today is our second house. So it was from Lincoln Court to Confederate Drive.
You have mentioned in the past to me that every time I take my child to Palmer Park, that you are the reason why that is there. You need to explain that.
I'm really tooting my own horn, but that's one of the proudest things in my life, and it's maybe that shows how small my ambitions are. But when we were at Lincoln Court, right up the street, about 800 yards up the street on the other side of Leake Avenue, there was a school called Palmer School, P-A-R-M-E-R. And my wife, Sally, had actually gone to Palmer School for a couple of years, and then she went to Ensworth. But Palmer was a victim of busing. Palmer and Woodmont were both excellent elementary schools, and when busing hit Nashville, Palmer's in a very affluent neighborhood, but it was going to be it's going to be an integrated school, and people abandoned there's local elementary schools, and Palmer was eventually closed and had been closed for many years. and there was just a shell of building on that lot. And we got some sort of notice one night to come to Aquinas because there was going to be a meeting about what was going to happen to the Palmer School property. And Pat Wilson announced that night. I don't remember, maybe he was in charge of this development, but what I remember is he announced that Palmer was going to be torn down, the building was going to be torn down, and condominiums were going to be put up in the 8 acres that was the Palmer School property. I've got nothing against condominiums, but it was just a pristine piece of property right in the middle of Belmead. Actually, 3 acres are in Belmead, 5 acres are in Metro, and it's an 8 acre piece. But anyway, and there are really no parks near there. You have to go all the way down to Percy Warner to go to a park, and notwithstanding all these residents, all these people with kids, there's no place to take your child to play. And Percy Warner's not, it's a woodsy, hilly park.
Gyms,
it's not a park where you stroll your kids. So I just thought that was a terrible idea to turn that into condominiums. And I don't know what overcame me. Not a very smart move for a young lawyer in a law firm looking for business from affluent clients to go on the warpath. But I got together with some other people, and one of them was Charles Coggin, an old curmudgeon who always had a political cause in his back seat, and a wonderful old man. But he and I somehow teamed up, and we began to rally against the condominium development and push for a park. And I didn't have any idea what I was doing, but we sat out in front of the Palmer School with straw hats on that said, park, and went door to door all the way through Belmead. And Al Whitson, my friend Al Whitson, who I went to UVA with, happened to live right on the corner of Palmer Park up on what used to be called Bellevue. I think they've changed the name of that street now. But Al got the brilliant idea to do an overlay. We got petitions signed from, Belmead and all the people surrounding Palmer Park, and we colored in red everybody who'd signed the petition in favor of a park. It was one of those great graphic displays that really showed that the sentiment was, 90% in favor of a park. Although there may be some people who come in there and play basketball, meaning African Americans might actually come over and play basketball. There was some of that stuff going on, but the pushback wasn't very hard. Charles Fentress was the councilman, and the mayor of Belmead was against the park, and Fentress was giving it this, But we went to the planning commission. And slowly the tide began to turn, and I'm trying to remember exactly how this went, but the property was owned by the school board, but they eventually just deep sixed the condo idea and turned Palmer Park into a neighborhood park. And they left. This was Mr. Coggin's idea. They left the doorway of Palmer School as an archway with the steps, just sort of an edifice to honor the park. Put in this wonderful playground, and just made it this beautiful 8 acre park. And we had no children when we began that, but we then had children that we took to the park. And I never forget, my wife, Sally, one day ran into Patrick Wilson's wife, who thanked her for the effort that was led to make that a park. And I still ride my bike past there and think, what I learned about that, it was an intuition, but parks change lives. It may sound silly to say an 8 acre park changes lives, but when you have a park, people go to the park, they meet each other, they talk, they have a community space, and that's so important when we're in these suburban neighborhoods with no sidewalks and no place to meet, and everybody gets in their car and drives to work, drives home and pulls their car into their automatic door garage. A park changes all that. It's an open space where everybody can go. And so that obviously you can tell by my enthusiasm how I feel about that, but I still drive by there. And Woodmont also became a park, where Woodmont School was. And there was a similar effort at Woodmont to make Woodmont a park. And I think today I think you could find no one who has any regrets about it. And I go over there today, and now I'm a grandfather, and I take my granddaughter over there, and last time I was over there was a 4-year-old birthday party going on at one of the picnic tables, and it's just good feelings.
When you talk about how you got involved in the Palmer Park thing, you said that you're a young lawyer. It may have been a foolish thing to do at the time, but talk to me a little bit about your beginning of your practice of law, raising a family. having a wife and balancing, putting it all together, making sure the pieces all fit?
Well, you're doing that now, and you realize how how difficult that is. It never gets easy. Things have gotten harder. They're harder for you than they were for me. But learning how to practice law from 1983 to when my first child was born and having a second child and a third child, there's lots of balance. I was fortunate in our world to have a wife who wanted to be a stay-at-home mother. She worked some. She put me through law school as an admissions counselor at Vanderbilt, and then she worked some after that. But when the kids came, we were pretty set that we were going to be a traditional family. And I don't say that in disrespect to people who don't make that choice, but I don't know how I could have carried on the balance without that. Maybe with the first child, but children 2 and 3. I mean, we had fairly stereotypical roles. I practiced law, and it took everything I had to practice law. I was, a lot of hours. I had to work very hard to get where I wanted to be and to be competent. And Sally took her role as nurturer, and I spent kid time. I did Cub Scouts. I did a lot of things, and I made an effort. My oldest son was not a sports guy like I was, so we did Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and that meant a Cub Scout meeting every month in that backyard right there. And I tell you what, if you want to get a migraine, we run a Cub Scout meeting. But I coached my daughter in basketball, and I tried to do the balance, and now that I have 3 grown children and I'm at this stage, I can say I did a pretty good job, but it was a struggle. There were times when I wasn't here that I should have been, and I'm sure there were times I didn't spend enough time on my law practice because I was at a Cub Scout meeting, and I had all those pressures that you same ones you had today. It was balance, 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 and I watched a lot of people not make the balance. I mean, it's a very especially if you're litigating, which I did a lot of. There's never enough time to put into a case that you're going to take to court, and it can just swallow you up. And you get so focused on it, you dream about it, you eat it, you breathe it, you live it, and it's hard to get out of your head sometimes. You got a child tugging on your pant leg, and you're doing your opening argument to the jury in your brain, and you think you're at home and you're not, and I don't know what else to say about it. You just do the best you can and try to, like any professional does. I mean, we're not, I'm sure, architects and accountants and doctors all do the same thing, but it's tough. It's tremendously rewarding, but it's a difficult thing.
Would you recommend the practice of law to your children?
Yes. None of them have done that, and I don't know, I never have really asked them, was it because of the frowns you saw on my face when I came home, or did I express any displeasure? I don't remember complaining, and I don't remember being negative about my practice. I know they thought I was very intense and that I worked very hard. They had that perception. But my oldest son is in medical school. My daughter is very artistic and is what's called a visual merchandiser, and she designs store interiors and was an art major for a couple of years, and then she moved over to more of an entrepreneurial business major. And my younger son is an actor, producer, director, singer. He could do anything he wanted, but none of them have been inclined. And so I've always taken the attitude, if you want to practice law, I would give you a lot of reasons why it's a great thing to do, and I would warn you about the difficulties. But I would absolutely advocate it if it suits you. I wouldn't try to cram them into that or suggest that they need to do that versus something else. And they all it became apparent fairly quickly that was not where any of them were going to go.
Well, switching gears to more the nuts and bolts of the daily practice, do you know or do you remember your first client?
Well, I thought about this question, and they're really two. I guess I want to respond with telling two stories. Business. I want to talk about profit and pro bono. When I hit the law firm, every young lawyer is looking for stuff to do. You have to find clients, you have to find work, and one of the first people I really made a guy named Joe Sadler who was at Third National Bank, which was later acquired by SunTrust. And back then, the special assets, that's a euphemism for the people who collect bad loans, or you call them workout people, tended to be the less educated, rougher crowd of people who ended up at banks. The people who made loans and rose in the bank tended to be have advanced degrees and grow up in more affluent circumstances. Well, Joe grew up on the other side of the tracks off Charlotte Avenue. And he came to Third National Bank from Associates Finance, which is a high interest rate, money lender, payday type of lender, loan on your house furniture and come pick it up if you don't pay. And Joe used to tell stories about making loans in West Virginia and driving up into the holler, shooting his gun off so everybody would know he was coming because they needed him. They needed to borrow his money, but if he didn't warn them he was coming up the holler, they'd kill him. And he also told stories about going into a hotel room and putting his gun on the bed and having people come and pay their weekly loan payments back to him. And he was a tough guy. And but he was the nobody at Third National Bank, and I was a nobody at my practice. And so I paid attention to him. I liked him, and we bonded. And he was repoing cars, and I was helping him, or doing low-level work on bad loans at Third National. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, and I like this guy. He was in his 50s, and I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and we spent 20 years working together. And he rose in the ranks of the bank as collecting bad loans became more and more important. Joe had a real knack for collecting loans, and I don't say that he wasn't a rough. I mean, he was a smart banker. He helped people if their loans were in trouble but could be rehabilitated. He would help them rehabilitate their loans and keep their businesses and keep their assets. But when he needed to play hardball, he'd go into the room and say, "I want my money." I mean, he knew the people he needed to run off from the bank, and he knew the people that he could help, do well. He was not punitive. He was not a lot of workout people because they have power over the borrower when the loan's in default. Like to flex their muscles. Joe, for a person of relatively limited education, was really, really savvy about the way he handled loans. And I watched him preserve the businesses of a lot of people, one of whom was a Belle Meade businessman who was so upset that he wasn't any longer meeting with the president of the bank and had to go meet with Joe Sadler behind his gunmetal gray desk. That he could barely stand it and didn't get to go to the Third National Bank dining room anymore because he was no longer in good favor with the bank. Joe helped him cut some expenses in his business and save his business. And I watched that man come back from his Belle Meade home and thank Joe for what he'd done several months after it kind of dawned on him what Joe had done for him. So I was immensely fortunate to start a relationship with a guy like that, and who taught me a lot, and I taught him a lot too. I mean, we had to learn the law of workout and collection and bankruptcy, but that became a really critical part of my legal career. And then, of course, I met other workout people after that, but Joe was phenomenal. And then from the pro bono side, I hadn't been in practice more than about 2 years when I met Barbara and Norman Worsley. I don't know what kid they were on at that time, maybe their fourth, but they were just poor. They were poor. I think they were getting evicted. And I went over to General Sessions Court and represented them. And then they ended up filing bankruptcy, and I represented them. And 30 years later, I was still representing. Barbara Worsley is still my client. It's just been, and I learned so much from her, trying to keep her family together. Barbara and Norman divorced, but Barbara, she had all the panoply of problems that people of her very limited education, health, and financial concerns have. And I mean, she would, every 6 months or a year, she'd call me up with, "Mr. Goodrich, my son's in jail," or whatever. And I just appreciated her so much. She tried so hard and was of such limited means, but that just opened up another world to me. Having a long-term relationship with her. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having, a one-shot pro bono deal where you go to court for somebody, but seeing her life over a period of years and the hardships was really an interesting experience.
So you primarily practiced throughout your career in bankruptcy.
Right.
How did you come to that? Was it your decision, or when you got a job at Farris Warfield, they said, here's your desk, you're a bankruptcy lawyer?
Well, I'm going to call this the Italian Army story. I wanted, as I said, I thought my skill set had a lot to do with argument, and you know, like every other young person, I watched Perry Mason and, you know, thought law was about being in court. Of course, there was a lot more to it than that, but that was an early impression that I had. So when I was interviewing with Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday, they said, well, we don't need any litigators right now. We don't need courtroom lawyers. We need a transactional attorney to do loan deals. Farris Warfield did a lot of work with Third National Bank. And I had very much enjoyed intellectually my Article 9 UCC class, my Article 3 UCC class, and felt like that would be fine. I really wanted to stay in Nashville, loved the firm. I thought, well, you know, in terms of my career, I'm happy to engage in some transnational work and see how I can do drafting documents and, you know, put my litigation aspirations on hold. So I came to the firm and started doing that. And of course, I learned law school does not teach you a lot about deeds of trust and loan agreements and some of the stuff I had to learn, but I got this tremendous education the hard way the first couple of years of my practice in doing loan transactions with primarily two people. A guy named Steve Ramp and Julian Bibb were both doing a lot of transactional work, and they taught me tons, and I was, you know, started from nowhere. So I got grounded in a whole lot of commercial work that I enjoyed, but it wasn't my passion, but it was really important, turned out to be really important. So that's 83, 84, 85. And there were occasional bankruptcies happening at that time too. And our bankruptcy department consisted of Steve Ramp on occasion, who was a brilliant, brilliant lawyer, and Brad McLean, who was working for Steve Ramp, and then me occasionally. And we were going to bankruptcy court to get stay relief to repo cars for Williamson County Bank and just doing various bankruptcy things. But we were going to court. And I noticed that the litigators, the people who were supposed to be doing litigation for commercial cases, were spending a lot of time in depositions and you know, a lot of pre-court work that rarely ended up in court. Trials settled. You know, I was getting to court all of a sudden with some frequency on minor matters, but I was getting to go to court and argue things, and without a whole lot of. I mean, Brad and Steve were great, but we were so new. I was kind of making it up as I went along sometimes and going down to court and learning, as you do when you're on your own, learning a tremendous amount about how to get around the bankruptcy court, how to file pleadings, and how to go argue. So in 1986, the tax code was amended substantially to take out a lot of the tax credits that people who were doing real estate investments had been receiving up to that point. It sort of pulled the rug out from under the real estate market. It was a major deal. A lot of limited partnerships had been formed, which were totally dependent on these continuous tax credits for investing in real estate. So real estate values plummeted. Nothing like in 2008, but it was a big deal, and especially in Nashville. So all of a sudden, the bankruptcies just exploded. And my somewhat meager bankruptcy practice just took off. All of a sudden, there were bad loans everywhere. And we were, again, we were lightly staffed to do it. So I'm in court. I'm now trying cases. People are, in fraud cases. I'm trying non-dischargeability cases. I'm opposing plans of reorganization. I'm representing banks. And Nail Falls, who was one of our litigators, and with some disdain, called us the Italian Army because he didn't think we know how to litigate. he was very, I don't know, just like, why are you guys getting to do all this litigation? You guys don't know what you're doing. And we did, and it wasn't real mean-spirited, but, the people in the litigation department who were my age at that point, who had been out 4 or 5 years, maybe they hadn't tried a case, maybe they hadn't argued a motion. And I'd been to court. My courtroom experience began to vastly accelerate, not only in bankruptcy court, but in chancery court, because there were a lot of guarantee lawsuits and a lot of things that commercial disputes that went to chancery court. So my litigation, going back to where I started from, I kind of came in through the side door, and received a lot more litigation experience than I would have had I gone the traditional route and gone straight into a litigation department. You know, I was much more seasoned by 1989 than a lot of people who were litigators.
So, talk to me. You mentioned that the bankruptcy code changed. What was the bankruptcy bar like when you started, and how has it evolved over time?
I came in at a really interesting time. In 1978, there was a new bankruptcy code, and the whole bankruptcy system changed dramatically. And before the new bankruptcy code in 1978, there was a referee system where there was a person in the process who was sort of the judge and sort of the trustee, and it was informal and there wasn't that much money involved, and bankruptcy courts didn't have that much power. I won't go into a great deal of detail, but it was a rudimentary system that was not developing very well, and obviously Congress thought it unsatisfactory. So this new bankruptcy code was enacted, which created bankruptcy judges who had immensely more power to influence affairs and to enter judgments. And when I got out of law school in '83, only 5 years later, it was still in its infancy. And a lot of the older lawyers didn't want to learn the new bankruptcy code, which was very complex, kind of like the tax code, and they had no stomach at whatever age they were, 50, 60 years old, for staying in that bankruptcy game. So a lot of the old players left. Some people stayed, but it became a younger lawyer's game, because that's what happens when the law changes dramatically in an area, and you have older practitioners who are used to doing things a certain way, and at some point they just are not going to, undertake what they need to undertake to get in the game for the next phase. We had two bankruptcy judges in Nashville, Keith London and George Payne, who were appointed to the bench very, very young. They were appointed in '78 or '79. Gosh, I want to say they were 30. Maybe they were 35. They were very young, but they were both very smart, very different, but they were both ambassadors of the bankruptcy system and took their jobs very seriously, promoted the bankruptcy code, promoted the bankruptcy courts, both locally and nationally. They would go to the national conventions, and every time I'd go to a national convention later on, somebody would say, well, do you know George Payne? Do you know Keith London? Because they were so influential in promoting what they were doing and how the bankruptcy code was working. George was kind of the ambassador, very gracious, very smart, very Southern. Keith was the intellectual, hard-nosed, a little more sarcastic, more intellectual rigor maybe, but they both brought a lot of value to the system. And so this new system was emerging in 1983. Steve Ramp knew it. He was just a genius and could figure out anything. Brad McClain got really into it and became a very good bankruptcy practitioner. But Ray Busey was around then as an early big player. John McLemore. John was telling stories way back then. But this bankruptcy bar began to develop, of which I was a little bit of a younger member. Steve Ramp and Ray and John were older than me. But it was a good group of people who were learning a new skill set. Bob Waldschmidt.
Bill Norton, your friend.
Bill Norton, who had mentioned about law school. Bill became early on. Bill's dad was a bankruptcy judge in Atlanta. Bill eventually became a major bankruptcy player in town and nationally, which he still is. So we had this really fine group of lawyers learning new law, forming, relationships in an environment that was, when you're in a small environment where everybody keeps seeing everybody, people learn to treat each other with some degree of respect and knowing that they're going to see them again. So it was a fairly civilized group of people who weren't set out to, burn the world down, and they were all learning. So it became again, very much to my good fortune, became a wonderful place in which to practice law. That niche, that subset of litigation and commercial law, which was the bankruptcy court, I got very comfortable there. Began spending most of my time there. In 1994, I actually became certified as a business bankruptcy specialist, and you had to have a certain number of hours in bankruptcy and I had to take another exam, like a bar exam. But at that point, my practice was steeply invested in bankruptcy.
whether they're in bankruptcy, the bankruptcy bar, whether they're out of the bankruptcy bar, talk to me about a few of your mentors just in developing the practice and developing your legal career.
I thought about it. We've thought about some of these questions, and that's been a fun one to think about, because I hope I've learned to take a little bit of what you try to do is take a little bit from everybody. I've had geniuses. Steve Ramp was a genius. By the way, after 13 years of practicing law, he went to Princeton Seminary and became a minister. He'd had enough, but he was an absolute genius as a lawyer. I mean, the man's mind was just unbelievable. And part of it had to do with I was a new lawyer, but he really was a genius. And commercial transactions, he could put together and take apart a commercial transaction like some mechanic taking a carburetor apart. I mean, complexity, he just ate it up. Brad McLean, genius. Founders medalist at Vanderbilt, just these minds, and the way they would analyze problems objectively, methodically, take things apart, put them back together, really study the way transactions were structured and what the law was. And then there were, and this is not to take away from his intellect, but there were people like Julian Bibb who were incredible with clients, who had an ability to put their clients in a position where they trusted them. They followed, and that for well-deservedly. I mean, Julian, they followed up. They tended to their clients all the time. They put their clients first ahead of everything, and they developed a very loyal following as a result of their dedication to their clients' welfare and their just, relentless desire to please clients and to do client service. And then there are other, like Fred Williams is another person I remember learning how to listen. Going to a meeting with Fred Williams, who was with me at Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday, and a client is trying to express something to you, and the lawyers are the articulate ones, and the clients are not necessarily the articulate ones. And we would go into a conversation with a client and walk out, and Fred would say, "Well, what did you just hear?" And I would spout off something, kind of surface. And Fred heard something completely different than I did, because he was watching what the client was doing. He was piercing through he got to what the client was trying to say as opposed to what the client was getting out, because he just understood the whole context of the conversation. A really, really keen listener, and he would say things like, "This is what this guy really wants. This is where he's really going." He may not have articulated it in a way that, that you heard, but this is what I got out of this meeting, and this is what we need to do. And that deep, what I call deep listening, that listening with everything you've got, paying complete attention to what somebody is saying to you, is a tremendous lawyer skill. Tom Kanaday at the podium, unbelievably articulate, quick wit, on the ball all the time, prepared, quick responses to judges' questions and appellate argument, just dazzling, courtroom ability, just wonderful. And then, of course, your grandfather, Charlie Warfield, who was the founder of Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday, courteous to a fault. Watched him. He tried one case with me and completely took a witness apart without ever raising his voice or being the least bit confrontational. He just completely unmasked this guy on the witness stand with just persistent, well-aimed cross-examination questions that were just, it was a joy to behold him do that. So I have had the pleasure and the good fortune to see. All those people had skills other than the ones I mentioned, but I highlight some things that just really, really meant a lot to me.
You mentioned to me before this interview started that you see yourself in the practice now as moving from more of a mentor kind of guiding hand and working with the firm and its culture. Talk to me about how you embraced firm culture, how you have taken that sort of corporate mindset and how you see that playing out in the law firm culture today.
Well, there's a lot. There are lots of questions in what you just asked, so I'll start somewhere. Every firm has a culture, and it can be it's usually a mixed bag, but it can be better or worse. I didn't know anything about Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday's culture that's where I began work. I knew a little bit about it by reputation, but I had the really good fortune to be in a firm with a really, really strong culture, really good values. Charlie Warfield, we had a client early in my career who was somewhat abusing the firm, asking the firm to do things that maybe it shouldn't have been doing, putting young lawyers under pressure to take positions that that those lawyers were not comfortable taking, griping about the bills after the fact, and just making the life of those lawyers very, very difficult. An abusive client, but it was a significant client. It might have been, 25% of our business at the time in a small firm. And it's very easy to get dependent on somebody like that, even though they're abusive. And you think, what are we going to do with that 25% of our revenue? Well, your grandfather fired that client. And there's a longer story than that. But he basically saw what was happening to the firm. The client came in to do its sort of typical post-work haggling on the bill, just to get away with it. And your grandfather very nicely said, you have a problem with the bill? Well, that's just fine. You don't have to pay the bill at all. It's been really nice representing your company, and we thank you very much. And leaving the person agape because they had no intention of getting rid of the firm. They were just trying to do their usual after-the-fact cost cutting, and it was much. But they were also a very corrosive influence on the firm, and that sort of boldness and respect for the values of the firm, were part of the culture of Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday. Same era, I wander over to General Sessions Court, and Tom Kanaday, master litigator, is over there doing some pro bono eviction case for some client on the pro bono docket, on the docket. And, that's one of the master lawyers of Nashville doing his pro bono time. So that culture of Farris, Warfield, Kanaday, and another example is seeing Charlie Warfield again, heading up a FISC board meeting in the Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday conference room at a FISC crisis time. Of course, he's not being paid for that. FISC is in major crisis, and your grandfather is, saving the day for FISC and providing leadership to FISC. So I grew up, and I can tell you countless Julian Bibb stories about his efforts, and then Brad McLean's death penalty efforts later. But, I saw numerous examples of, we are lawyers. We represent our clients very well. We do all the work that we're very professional, but we also, we go a step beyond.
In that last answer, you mentioned a little bit about giving back to the community. Also, this sort of role of lawyers. What do you see as the role of lawyers in the future?
I don't think it's going to change all that much. Of course, the technology has changed the way we deliver services tremendously. And you have to have a whole different skill set now in terms of your proficiency in technology to deliver services to your client, written product, research, things like that. But the role of lawyer, and a couple points. First, in the mainstream representation of clients, and you and I both do this, the role of lawyer as trusted and valued counselor to give advice in difficult situations, that's not changed. You have to develop a relationship with your client. The law continues to be very complex and very difficult. The fact patterns are probably more difficult than they used to be, although they've always been difficult. And the lawyer stepping into, in our world, what you and I do, a complex commercial situation, and bringing some order to chaos, and bringing people together to see if things can achieve resolution of difficult issues. First, understanding of difficult issues and the difficult situations. That's first. You've got to understand what the situation is and be very objective. And our clients often come to us not in a very objective posture because they want things to be a way that they're not. So in bringing reality to your clients about what situation they find themselves in, and then guiding them to a resolution, maybe litigation, that's always been sort of fundamental to what we do. It's challenging, it's really, really interesting, and it's very, very satisfying. We are, in the commercial world, people laugh at, what's the utility of, so you're a bankruptcy lawyer, you're not saving the environment, or you're not doing courageous, great things, but we have the most sophisticated, productive economy in the world, maybe in history. And the lawyers play a very significant role in keeping that economy going. They mediate disputes. They give people the perceptions, of not always the reality, that if you act right, then you'll be treated right, and if you act badly, then you will be punished in the commercial sense. Breach of contract, fraud, things like that. Now, the system always doesn't work, but it's good enough to where we are fundamental in creating a system in which behavior is governed. With trillions of dollars moving every day, people act. We get down on fraud in the United States or breach of contract and behavior, but if you leave our borders and think about what happens in the rest of the world, I mean, we run an amazingly productive, efficient, honest economic system, and we have a lot to do with that. So I don't think that's changed. I think that's become more and more important, and that role, I think that role continues. Was there more to that question?
No, it was just, the question was more, I guess you answered it, which was basically, what is the role of the lawyer? I mean, you can take any young associate or any lawyer in the commercial world and ask them why do they matter, and that you got to that. So
I give that speech a lot to young lawyers about bankruptcy and commercial law who are, doubtful about whether they're adding value to society, because everybody, in my way of thinking, everybody wants to not just make a living when we make a very good living, but feel like they're contributing. And you get mired in a commercial dispute, sometimes you lose perspective on the value that you're bringing to the system as a whole. When you're I guess when you're part of an ant colony and you're moving one little twig around, it's hard to realize how important your function is in the overall scheme of things. And you have to be reminded every once in a while that that's really important, and that you are adding value to. Even talking your client down from bad behavior. We have clients who are not always behaving the way we want. Even helping them understand that and getting more in line with what should be expected is add that up times the number of times that happens. It's a pretty amazing difference in the way we behave.
Right. You just turned 60, correct?
Right.
And right now you are taking, I guess, a pause from the practice. So tell us a little bit what's going on.
Well, yeah, that sounds like I'm, a leisurely break. I practiced 33 years. On November 30th, I had been to the doctor because I'd had a flu that had kind of hung on. My grandchildren were here, and I thought I got a bug from them, which maybe I did. But the flu hung on for a couple more days, and so I decided to get a physical. I decided to just go in for the flu, and I went in to see my doctor, and he said, "You need some blood. You seem to be recuperating from the flu, but why don't you go get some blood work done while you're here," which I had not done for a few years. So reluctantly, I went downstairs and spent another hour at the doctor's office in the middle of the day, which makes me anxious because I want to be at the office. Got all this blood work done, and that night, that was about 3 o'clock, that night at 6 o'clock, I was driving away. I went back to work. I was driving down Elliston Place to the Marriott, where there was going to be a Mid-South Commercial Law Institute function, social function, and I had some responsibilities there. And my cell phone rang, and it was my doctor. Doctors, how often does your doctor call you on your cell phone? Never. And my doctor said, "You need to go to the emergency room." What? And then he rattled off a bunch of blood counts, which were all Greek to me, about my platelets and my red cells and my neutrophils, which I've learned a lot about since then, and told me basically my neutrophils were so low that I was very susceptible to disease, and if I had a disease, I had no immune system, and so I could die if I got sick. And so I went over to the Marriott for a few minutes to do the couple little things I needed to do, and I bounced over to the Vanderbilt emergency room, which is right around the corner. Spent the night in the emergency room getting pumped full of antibiotics and getting blood sucked out of my arm, and which led the next day to bone marrow biopsies. And when I got to the bone marrow biopsies, I figured something is not well. All is not well here, because the blood test didn't bring out any of the innocuous causes of my blood counts being so bad. So I had a bone marrow biopsy, and a week later I was told I have some significant blood disorder, probably leukemia. That was on December 6th, and on December 13, the diagnosis was more specific, and I've got something called acute myeloid leukemia, or AML. And I was told that you need to get into treatment right away because this is a very aggressive disease, but you can, we can put you on some antibiotics and take you through Christmas so you can spend Christmas with your family, and then we need to get you started with chemotherapy. So from the 13th on, I may have started this a little earlier, but I realized I could not practice law anymore. I mean, given the fact I was headed toward a prolonged chemotherapy treatment and possibly a bone marrow transplant. So I had to start handing off my practice as quickly as I could. And so for the rest of December, until December 28th, when I checked into Vanderbilt, I was spent all my days talking to clients, unloading cases, preparing for my departure, which was tough. It was tough just to do it, but it was tough emotionally to go from, and I wrote about this, and I like to write, and I wrote a mini memoir about going from lawyer to patient. So I find myself, after 33 years, changing my self-identity right now is as patient, and I'm being a patient every day. I was at the doctor this morning getting my blood tested once again. So I'm now in the period of being a patient, and I've been a patient since December 28, and it looks like I'll be a patient through the summer and into the early fall. And if all goes well, I'll be a human being again, and then we'll decide whether I'm going to be a lawyer again.
Well, I'm going to ask this question. You mentioned identity. Let's just say you come back to practicing law, you practice another decade. How would you want, you laugh.
Yeah.
What do you want people to think of your identity as a lawyer? And I'm using that word not remembered, but how would they want to identify you as a lawyer?
I've come, I thought about that. We talked about that a little bit earlier. It's taken me a long time to appreciate what it means to be a fine lawyer. Maybe fine's not the right adjective. Excellent lawyer. I could stick a number of superlatives in there, but as what it means to be a lawyer has expanded in my mind, and we've talked a lot about those things. What you bring to the table, what you bring to the people you represent, the compassion, the excellence, the aggressiveness, the combination of things you bring in each instance. I've really become to appreciate what it means to be a lawyer. And if I had 15 years ago, I wouldn't have said, well, he was an excellent lawyer. That would be like, well, that's pretty, so what? I wouldn't have said so what, but to me, that would be more than enough tribute at this point, because what it means to be a lawyer means a lot more to me as I've watched and hopefully experience some of what being a lawyer means. So to me, the law continues to be, this sounds really like an American Bar Association speech, but the law continues to be a wonderful profession with tremendous opportunity to make a difference. And if you can do that, that's a lot. So he was an excellent lawyer. I mean, that's to me is the very, very high praise.
And the sort of undertones of the when you say an excellent lawyer, what do you mean? What?
Well, that to me means he had I may have to use the word excellent again, but he understood the law, the mechanics of the law, how the law worked, the legal principles that were in play. He understood how to apply those to a situation. He wasn't just an abstract thinker, but he could take those principles and apply them to, he could understand messy, difficult, factual situations and take those legal principles and apply them to problems, whether they be litigation, whether they be negotiation, whether they be drafting. And he could meld the messiness of the real world with the abstract nature of the law, help his clients understand how that law applied to those facts, and then guided his client to a resolution of whatever problem that was presented by that, whether it be through litigation, whether it be through resolution, whether it be through drafting of contracts that with an understanding of what the client needed to establish a relationship. So that's part of being an excellent lawyer, practicing law and understanding, getting back to Fred Williams, understanding what that client really wanted, being focused on the real issue at hand, and making sure you understood what the problem was before you decided to try to solve it. And then the other piece of being a lawyer to me is, and this is something you've been good at, but I think being a lawyer gives you it's not unique, but it's an unusual platform for you to engage in society. People respect lawyers as much as people throw around disdain. I mean, I could work on Palmer Park, I could work on Radnor Lake, I can work on the death penalty. So many opportunities to be a lawyer in the community, to be respected as a lawyer. When I say somebody's an excellent lawyer, I don't mean they were it's a lot, they just practiced law. That's not diminishing the practice at all. I have tremendous respect for somebody who just does that, but my term of excellence means they acted as a lawyer in the community. They always looked for ways to engage in the community that were not about a fee, that were Charlie Warfield examples of the community at large. I have a responsibility to the community at large, and I'm going to do this whether I get any clients or not from this, whether I get paid for this or not. Even if I run away some clients, this is something that's important to me, and I'm going to be engaged in. My death penalty work could very easily, I'm opposed to the death penalty, and you and I have had that conversation, but I have been very willing to take that position with clients who are conservative, who are probably pro-death penalty, and I found that they respect that very much, even if we have a difference of opinion, because I'm not going to be reticent to push what I believe in. So an excellent lawyer has that community. That's a given that you've got that community engagement as part of being an excellent lawyer. I'm sure there's some other things I could say, but if you can practice law, and if you want to raise a family, and if you can engage in the community with your legal skills, you're in pretty rarefied air.
You worked for, we got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
You've worked for 2 law firms. What do you want your lasting legacy as a corporate citizen of those 2 law firms to be?
Well, in the early, I guess always I want to be thought of as somebody who practiced law extremely well in those firms, made the firms proud of the quality of the law practice, because that's what firms do, and that I would want my legacy to be that when you thought of Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday, or Stites and Harbison, or Byrne Foreman, and you thought of excellent legal practice, that I added to the enhancement of the quality of the practice that we delivered. That may be the external. I would also like to have been thought of as a really good corporate citizen within the firm, and by that I mean I participated in its governance. I didn't carp, I didn't bitch, I didn't tear down efforts to run the firm. Law firms are difficult things to run. in my particular case, I would hope that my legacy was I mentored. As I learned a lot of things the hard way, I was willing to pass those experiences on to younger lawyers and help them avoid some of the holes I stepped in, and that my mentoring was, seen as something to be emulated by other lawyers as they came up. Because I think the mentoring is an absolutely critical aspect of a firm's health and growth, to have people around who are at some stage in their career willing to, perform a mentoring role. So I guess excellent lawyering and mentoring are the two things that come to mind.
Is there anything else that I haven't asked that you wanted to?
I could talk all day, but I think you've done a good job, Patrick, as you always do.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and ask you these questions.
It was fun. Thank you.